Let's start with our first topic. Less than 2 weeks after U.S. President Donald Trump announced he will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, Mike Pompeo strongly criticized Iran yesterday as he outlined the American plan of action in his first speech as U.S. Secretary of State. Pompeo said the U.S. will work to prevent the Islamic Republic from getting a nuclear weapon, adding that sanctions that have been lifted under the agreement are due to go back into effect.
We'll pursue these goals along several lines of effort. First, we will apply unprecedented financial pressure on the Iranian regime. The leaders in Tehran will have no doubt about our seriousness. Thanks to our colleagues at the Department of Treasury, sanctions are going back in full effect and new ones are coming. Last week, we imposed sanctions on the head of Iran's central bank and other entities that were funneling money to the IRGC Quds Force.
Let's go first to our studios in Washington. John Sitilides. Besides these sanctions that Pompeo talked about, he had these 12 demands or basic requirements for Iran. It seems, John, more like a wish list than a real post-nuclear deal strategy, doesn't it?
I don't know if one would call it a wish list so much as just an expectation of how a nation should conduct itself in 2018 on the international stage. And unfortunately, Iran has felt the ability to be able to act simply the way it chooses to in a very aggressive manner, not only in its immediate neighborhood, but across the Middle East and into South Asia, with the potential for nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles to be able to extort Europe, a number of U.S. allies in Asia and Africa in a very deleterious manner. And so what the Trump administration is simply doing is making very clear to Iran there are standards and norms which it expects Iran to be able to adhere to in order to be able to receive the kind of economic arrangements and normal diplomatic ties with the international community. Iran has a choice to make. If it chooses to move in a more appropriate behavioral direction, it will reap significant rewards. If it doesn't, it will pay the price.
Vivian, Pompeo claimed yesterday that withdrawing from the deal is in the interest of U.S. national security and it prevents the proliferation in the region. But how does isolating the U.S. from key allies, mainly Europe, and jeopardizing the limits on Iran's nuclear program accomplish those goals?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how your use of the term isolating. How does isolating? So you're presuming that I would agree with that premise that in acting as they are, they've.
Have you ever seen a wider gap between Europe and Trump after this?
How about saying that Europe is living in a fantasy land and they're isolating themselves in a world where appeasement
as well
is
as China and Russia?
Oh, some real stand-up international actors. I mean, if you look at there are other periods in time.
So we have one Rambo, Trump.
Why
That's
Rambo?
it.
Why Rambo? Why Rambo? He's and it's not just Trump. There's an administration. You know what? I think that I happen to agree with what they're doing, and I think that you're going to see, and you're already seeing, much more effective moderation of Iranian behavior than you certainly did under the kind of, appeasement approach of Obama and that Akiva prefers. Just the fact that Iran's staying in and they're making it clear we want to make a deal with the Europeans, right? They've sure changed their tune in 2 weeks.
Well, Israeli Prime Minister Akiva, Benjamin Netanyahu, applauded the speech, Pompeo's speech, saying it is the right policy. He said, we believe it is the only policy that can ultimately guarantee the security of the Middle East and bring peace in our region. And we call on all countries to follow America's lead here. Do you see other Western countries following Netanyahu's advice and joining these sanctions that are going to be put by Americans?
I don't think so, since Netanyahu put himself in the position, even before Trump did it, Rambo, I think it's Popeye, in the new context of regime change in Iran. They said a few days ago, Netanyahu, Bennett, Israel Katz, that we are calling before Pompeo did. And I think this is the most important thing that he said. That we are expecting the Iranian people to bring down the governments, the Ayatollah. Actually, by doing the supporting Pompeo, he rubs in the Judeo-Christo analysis that it's an Israeli, a Jewish, and Christian. We just saw the evangelical in Jerusalem,
the dedication ceremony.
John Hagee and the others. And I think that right now what we are doing is we are getting Iran out of the corner, out of the isolation, because it looks like a plot of both the Americans and the Israelis to do what they did to Saddam Hussein.
So let me ask you, John, about these repercussions, because you know, the U.S. and those who may cooperate with the Americans have the ability to damage the Iranian economy, which is already quite weak. What do you think the repercussions of these very strong sanctions will be that Mike Pompeo is considering?
It simply takes us back to where we were before the JCPOA in 2015. The sanctions were very effective in crippling the Iranian economy. And let's make sure that we frame our understanding of Iran correctly. Iran is a police state. It is not some benign entity in the Middle East. It is a police state with a very, very repressed society. They made very clear in 2009 and as recently as just several months ago that it does desire profound changes in governance in Iran. Now, our job is not to be overthrowing governments, but if the people decide to move in that direction and we're able to assist them in that direction organically, so be it. I mean, that's what the United States and the West tend to stand for. But Iran has been acting in a very untrammeled way since the 2015 deal. And let's remember, it was only a few weeks after the deal was agreed to, because nothing has ever actually been signed by anybody, we forget that also, that Qasem Soleimani traveled to Moscow and persuaded Vladimir Putin to send in his air force to be able to join with Hezbollah forces on the ground and Iranian proxies in order to keep the Assad regime afloat and essentially weaponize hundreds of thousands of refugees that are streaming into Europe and destabilizing societies in NATO and the European Union. Okay. So there's been zero moderation. Actually, it's just the opposite. Iran has felt absolutely emboldened under this agreement, and it's time to put this Iranian danger back into some containable element.
Okay, Vivian, you know, I see that you're agreeing, but President Hassan Rouhani and the Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif, they're considered somewhat, you know, moderate leaders, at least when it comes to Iran, even though under strict, you know, rule of the extreme Ayatollah Khamenei. Does the West not risk weakening this relatively moderate Iranian leadership with the way it's going?
I think that when you look at extremists like Rouhani and his ilk, to tag them with the moderate label is completely nonsensical. They're not moderate in any way. I mean, to pick up on the earlier comment, not only is it a police state, it is also a theocracy.
Right.
And the combination is very, very difficult. I totally disagree with Akiva, surprisingly. You know, when he says, oh, this is some big plot, you know, cooked up by...
It looks like a big plot.
By Israel and America.
The images.
Well, if you have a simplistic kind of, you know, way of looking at issues, then it may look cooked up. It's not about religion. It's about the way in which people are treated. It's about the lack of civil rights. It's about the lack of human rights. And one point is very, very important. Iran, and they know this, and it's clear from their behavior, they have a stark choice. They either continue to fulfill their nuclear ambitions, or they don't, and they have an economy.
And Saudi Arabia is a model of human rights. Come on.
What they're worried about is that
Trump
if they actually have an improved economy,
20 seconds.
If they have an improved economy, that the middle class will rise up and the mullahs are out.
Akiva, 20 seconds.
They have centrifuges spinning enriched uranium. There is no other reason to have them other than for nuclear weapons. They don't need them.
Okay, I'll tell you what, Akiva. I'll be back on the spin room with Akiva Eldar, John Sitilides, and Vivian Berkovich. Akiva, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I fully agree with John that Iran, you know, I'm not a pro-Iranian idiot, you know.
Okay.
But I agree with John. It's a police state.
Yes.
And people, there is a limit. And we saw for so many years that sanctions didn't work. And, you know, just imagine that you pull more sanctions on Israel in order to put an end to the occupation. Would it work? Would we bring down Netanyahu? No. We will support him more. We will go to Masada.
But what sanctions do is they force a choice on Iran, and then the international community can see what is this. Well, then our choice becomes much clearer, and the appeasement and the deal didn't work either.
I want to ask you this about Syria. Israel reported that Iranian-based forces in Syria launched 32 rockets on that attack on Israeli positions back on May 10th. That's a very high number, isn't it, Vivian? Shouldn't we basically define this thing as war? All out war. 32 rockets.
Well, let's look at it as the trailer, a little teaser.
A teaser?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's not a small number of rockets, but I don't think that Israel exactly wants. I don't think exactly when they've got hundreds of thousands stockpiled. So that's why.
Okay. I want to ask you, John, basically the same question. Also add to that, John, that the Israeli Air Force revealed today that Israel is the first country in the world to carry out an operational attack using the F-35 stealth fighter jet. The Major General of the Air Force said that it carried out 2 strikes with the F-35 on 2 different fronts. I'm wondering with you, any educated guess where those 2 strikes took place, and what do you make of Israel's military activity in Syria?
If it's okay, I prefer to put this into a larger context because Iran has been declaring war, or in effect engaged in war against Israel through proxies for years, if not decades. And the fact that now you've got Hezbollah that is sitting on about 100,000 rockets in the event that there's a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, and tens of thousands of lower-grade rockets in the hands of Hamas, means that Iran has been effectively arming Israel's most determined enemies on its borders. So Israel has every right to be able to strike back at Iranian forces that continue to pose a malign threat to it. And let me offer one interesting aspect here that was brought up by Secretary Mattis just recently, and that is that Iran may have made a strategic error in positioning so many of its significant military forces in southern Syria near the Golan Heights region, because before this, these were mostly out of reach of Israeli military forces. Now they're within reach. And when Israel has an opportunity to strike significantly at Iran's military capability, they're only a few dozen miles away from the border.
Okay, I want to move on to our next topic, that is Gaza. The Israel Defense Forces launched artillery strikes against the Hamas observation post in the southern Gaza Strip today after a group of Palestinians breached the security fence and set fire to an empty Israeli army position on the border. The IDF also confirmed that a mini drone from Gaza crossed over the border fence and fell in Israeli territory overnight. The incidents come 1 week after violent clashes on the border left more than 60 Palestinians dead in the single bloodiest day of conflict since 2014. Akiva, do you expect this, military tension and activity between Israel and Hamas to continue, or do you see kind of things subsiding?
I think that much depends on what Egypt will do about it and what kind of message they are getting from Washington these days. We saw the report that Trump is about to submit his blueprint, his ultimate peace plan. Egypt is an important player. We saw that they opened the Rafah crossing for a few days in order to ease the pressure on the Palestinian. We see that President Abbas is not doing very well these days. So everything is very fragile. And I think that the most important thing that we have to realize, as I mentioned before, that we don't want neighbors that have got nothing to lose. That the solution for their miserable life is ending it on the Israeli fence, at least with a good photo in the newspapers.
Vivian, Palestinians, they want to take this thing to court. They asked the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to open an immediate investigation into these alleged Israeli war crimes that they're calling against the Palestinians. Israel responding saying it's cynical and absurd. How concerned should Israel be of this kind of development, this legal development?
Well, it depends on, first of all, where it goes. I mean, the war crimes issue and accusation is not a new one. And it depends on whether or not the allegations are actually considered through a true legal or jurisprudential framework, or whether they're considered through a political framework. So, I mean, Israel never seems to do terribly well on the political front internationally. I would think that I know there's serious concern, and there always is serious concern about the ICC.
Right.
But this is not the first time we've seen this, and I have no idea where it's at, what the allegations are specifically, and how it's being treated. That I just can't opine on.
John, so far more than 100 Gazans have been killed, probably many of them Hamas operatives, even they admitted in Hamas. Yet the narrative that the international media, and especially U.S. media, where you are now, is the usual, correct me if I'm wrong, the David versus Goliath version. It's the Palestinian narrative that is winning there. Would you agree with that? That's how U.S. media is covering it?
Absolutely, and unfortunately. I mean, this is a scratched record that goes back decades now, and every time we see these types of provocations, unfortunately, by a Palestinian people that have been utterly failed by their leadership, going back decades, going back to the 1960s and the Palestine Liberation Organization. The Palestinian people need and deserve an opportunity for a decent life, like so many of their brothers and sisters in the area. They've been utterly failed and, even worse, exploited and humiliated by their leadership. Right now, Mr. Abbas in Palestine and the Hamas leadership in Gaza, who really don't care, I believe, in the end, about the well-being of their Palestinian citizens. These are power moves by the respective leadership. And when we talk about Gaza, let's remember, it's not just a quote-unquote Israeli blockade. Israel, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority are all working together to try to limit the power of Hamas in Gaza. But it's their own actions that have led to these Israeli tactics. And when you've got tens of thousands of people armed with flaming kites and stones and burning tires looking to rip through the border and go into towns and murder citizens, the Israeli Defense Forces have an absolute sovereign right to defend their territory and their citizens. So the issue is, what kind of actions and decisions will Palestinian leaders take to bring their people into the 21st century, to give them an opportunity at a consensual governing society, one that functions normally and brings about the long-term peace that I think all of us here in the U.S. and around the world would like to see come to the region.
Speaking of Palestinian leadership, Akiva, the president, Mahmoud Abbas, was hospitalized in Ramallah earlier this week for a severe ear infection, third time in a week. A lot of talk now about, successors for Abbas. I mean, we don't know who's that going to be, but could a new leader in the Palestinian Authority bring something new to the table in terms of the stalemate with Israel and this boycott of U.S. mediation?
Actually, I remember this same kind of question was put to me after Arafat was gone. People were hoping that Abu Mazen can be more flexible. We have to understand that there is no difference who is leading the Palestinian, if it is Abu Mazen or Rami Hamdallah, or it would be our hero, the last Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, who was the darling of the United States. They have
and
a clear, and you, they have the PNC resolution from '88, and they cannot move from this more than 1 or 2%. It's the 67 lines, borders, and it's maybe something for the refugees, and Jerusalem should be the city of the capital of two states.
Right.
That's it.
That's it.
Nobody can change it.
Okay, we have to go for commercial break. When we come back, more with John Sitilides. Vivian, we are back on Spinner with Akiva Eldar, John Sitilides, and Vivian Berkovich, who I'll let you take it away. You wanted to weigh in.
I did want to jump in and pick up on a very important point that John was making earlier. And it also ties into our discussion about Iran. That, it's time for, this is not an Israel-Gaza problem. It's not just Israel-Palestinian. It's a much broader issue. And not only does the international community have to become more engaged in terms of the economic life and prosperity of Gaza, but Hamas does.
Right.
And so in the same way that, the mullahs in Iran have to make a decision, do we want an economy or do we want nuclear weapons, Hamas has to also make a decision. Because do we want to keep diverting our money into terrorist infrastructure and taking away from civilians? Do we want to keep focusing on incitement? Or do we want to actually restore some degree of sanity to the Strip and allow the kind of economic cross-border cooperation that existed before they took over?
First of all, let's deal with our problems. Do we want a Jewish and democratic state, or do we want to occupy?
I think that we can solve this before we can solve that.
So let's stick.
No, you can't. Gaza is much more pressing than figuring out if we want a Jewish democratic state.
First, let's deal with our responsibilities.
Okay, I want to move on to our last topic.
I'm not running the puck. Yeah.
Okay. That's a Canadian little. Okay. Today, last topic today is anti-Semitism in Britain. Former London Mayor Ken Livingstone resigned from the Labour Party, saying that a row over anti-Semitism allegations against him had become a distraction for the party. But let's start with the Netherlands. A Dutch state-funded television show spoofed Israel's winning Eurovision song Toy by Netta Barzilai, prompting protests by critics who said the parody features classic anti-Semitic cliches about Jews and money. Let's take a look.
Word je land door stenen gooiers omzoomd. Bouw dan muren waar zelfs stroomland van droom. Gooi je boekenboek, ja, gooi je boekenraket. Gooi je boekenboek, ja, gooi je boekenraket. Gooi je boekenboek. Krijg je zo mooi. Opnieuw, ja, wel weer niet. Als 70 jaar lang wordt je feest door radicalen gecrashed. Op een ambassade zorg dat je casht. Van je tjingeling-tjing, van je ping, van je dozen cent. Ja, ja, van je tjinge-tjinge-tjinge-tjinge-tjinge.
Okay, let's start here in studio. That the part that triggered the criticism of anti-Semitism was this. It said, if your party's crashed, make sure you cash on embassies with your ka-ching, ka-ching, and your ping with your dollars, and cents on your funds with your ka-ching, 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 and making as if she's holding bills or money.
Money changer, yeah.
Right. Anti-Semitism or legitimate criticism of Israeli policies?
Well, she was focusing on Israel, on the occupation, and probably it fits to add something about coins, but if you want, you can look at it as an anti-Semite, anti-Rothschild, the
right.
big,
exactly.
Jewish plot. Yeah.
Why does it fit?
And
what fits?
No, it's with a sense of humor. It could fit into the song, okay? But you can't avoid looking these days that it is legitimate to be anti-Semite. In Europe.
In Europe.
In Europe.
That's a horrible situation. Yeah.
Our cup runneth over in Europe
right.
and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And we're also hearing some calls from various countries to boycott next year's Eurovision that will take place
led by
in Jerusalem.
Iceland, where there are 2 Jews. Yes.
Could be a very uncomfortable situation, couldn't it?
Yes, it could, but again, we've seen this we've been to this rodeo before.
Yeah.
There was the science conference in 2020, and there was a lot of talk among the Europeans of boycotting Israel and banning Israel until they realized that they wouldn't have a conference if they banned the Israelis. This is different. This is art. I expect it'll have some momentum. I expect there'll be many people who will agree, but at the end of the day, the countries, maybe not Iceland, but everyone else will send their contestants.
They will. Okay.
Actually,
I'm willing to bet on it, just like I did on JCPOA.
You were right. You were right about that.
Right.
the
Okay.
fact that we won the Eurovision shows that.
That's right.
They
John,
like us.
Okay, John, let's go to the UK. Former London Mayor Ken Livingstone announced that he's resigning from the Labour Party. He's actually been suspended since 2016 comments he made about Adolf Hitler supporting Zionism. Is this a sign of strength by Jeremy Corbyn's leadership trying to rid the party of anti-Semites, or the exact opposite, actually a weakness because he could have kicked him out 2 years ago?
Yeah, I don't really have much to offer in terms of internal British political debates, but I do want to note on one of the comments from your panelists there, and I think there is a troubling expansion of anti-Semitism in Western culture. We certainly see it very pronounced in Europe, but it's even starting to appear in American culture in ways that were unimaginable 10 or 20 years ago. And it was mostly once upon a time from fringe, very hard right-wing groups or neo-Nazi groups, but now what you see is it's begun to infect extreme left-wing organizations, universities in the United States, joined by radical Islamist organizations that are supported by Muslim Brotherhood or the Council on American Islamic Relations. And it's become acceptable now to be anti-Semitic under the guise of quote-unquote anti-Israel policies. But we never see these types of stereotypes used when we're criticizing the policies of countries in Africa or Asia, or anti-Muslim stereotypes when we're criticizing Arab or Muslim type policies. It's all singled out for Israel. It's very troubling, but we need to be very honest about this. It's a cancer in Western culture.
We have 30 seconds left. You want to wrap it up?
I just want to mention the fact that we invited 2 pastors that
John Hagee and Robert Jeffries.
Okay,
to the dedication ceremony,
who are known for their anti-Semite remarks.
Okay. Vivian?
They were invited to be keynote speakers.
Since I have 3 seconds, I just wanted to say every comment that was made about America and the acceptance of anti-Semitism there is exponentially more pronounced in Canada.
More pronounced in Canada?
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Absolutely. But we don't have any time.
We don't have any time. I'm sorry. That is all the time we have.